evening of October 4th, 1912, a United States political candidate was in his hotel room in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In less than an hour, he was scheduled to deliver a very important speech to local voters he hoped to sway in his favor. Even though he was nervous, he was really excited about giving this particular speech because he and his speechwriters had spent weeks putting together this 50-page script that he was now holding in his hands. And so he paced around the room, flipping through the first couple of pages of the script, reciting lines before checking his watch and seeing that it was time to go. And so he took a deep breath, he took his thick 50-page document, folded it in half, and then tucked it inside his right inner jacket pocket. And when he was ready, he walked out his hotel door, down the front steps, and out the front door of the hotel where a huge crowd was waiting for him. People were singing his praises and yelling to him and trying to get him to react to them as he walked out of the hotel towards his car. And as he was walking, his own personal security detail had formed up around him and were doing their best to keep the crowd at bay. And when the candidate finally got to his open-air car, he stepped inside and then stood up, took his hat off, and continued to wave to the crowd. And then right before his car was about to take off, there was a loud bang from somewhere out in the audience, and the candidate hunched over. He had been shot. His security detail immediately recognized who the gunman was, and they attacked him, kicking his gun away and putting him in a chokehold. And the rest of the crowd kind of forms up and begins beating on this gunman. And amidst all this chaos, the candidate who's just been shot stands up and yells to the crowd, "Don't kill him! Don't kill him! Bring the gunman to me." And the crowd is so surprised that their candidate is not on the ground because, again, he's just been shot, that they stop. They stop attacking the gunman. And even the security detail, they're just holding the guy in a chokehold, looking up at the candidate like, "Really? You're not down? You just got shot." And so the candidate looks at the gunman and he says, "Why'd you do it?" And the gunman stays silent. And so the candidate says, "Okay, just take this guy away." And so the security detail hand this guy off to the cops. And so now the crowd's all looking at the candidate, wondering how in the world he's acting like everything is totally okay, because again, he just got shot. And so this is when the candidate reaches into his jacket and he pulls out that thick script he had tucked inside of his right pocket, and he holds it up to the crowd, and there's clearly a bullet hole that went through the script. The script had stopped the bullet and saved the candidate's life. All of his aides were urging him to go to the hospital immediately, but the candidate refused and said, "Bring me to that speech." And just a couple of minutes later, the famous American president, Theodore Roosevelt, delivered his 50-page speech, although he did have to make some changes to it on the fly because there were holes on every page. On an icy cold December night in 1776, a farmer living in New Jersey looked out his window and thought he saw something move at the end of his road. He put his hands to the glass and tried to get a better look, but he couldn't see it. It was too dark, there was no illumination. But he didn't need to see it to know what it was. He could hear it coming. Panicked, he stumbled backwards, turned around, ran into his bedroom where he told his wife to stay in the house, keep the kids here, do not leave for any reason. And then this farmer bolted out his back door, hopped on his horse, and began blazing towards town. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew he had to warn the German man, Johann Rall. After riding for a couple of minutes, he arrived at the town of Trenton. He turned down a couple side roads, and then he arrived at this beautiful 2-story home where Johann was staying. And so the farmer got off his horse and walked towards the front door, and right before he got there, a German soldier came outside, shut the door behind him, and told the farmer to stop. And the farmer told the soldier in English that he had to speak to Johann. He had a warning for him, but the German soldier didn't speak any English, and so there was this total miscommunication, and at some point the German soldier indicated to the farmer that it was impossible for him to come inside, that Johann was actually playing cards and did not want to be disturbed, and so the farmer needed to leave. But the farmer was desperate and he pleaded with the soldier to let him speak to Johann. It was an emergency. He had a warning for him. But the soldier either again didn't understand or he just didn't care. And he tried to tell the farmer to leave once again. But the farmer really wasn't taking no for an answer, and so he pulled out a piece of paper and he scratched this ominous warning on it and he gave it to the soldier and he said, "Give this to Johann." And so the soldier reluctantly takes the note, he looks at it, it's in English, he can't read it, and so he just nods to the farmer and says, "Okay, I'll give it to Johann." Once the farmer had got back on his horse and left, the soldier turned around, went through the front door, and walked back to the dining room of the house where he found Johann around a table with a bunch of other guys laughing and drinking and playing cards. And this soldier very reluctantly walks up to Johann, hands him the note, and apologizes for the interruption. And Johann looks up at him. He's obviously annoyed and he scolds him for interrupting him. He takes the note and he looks at it and he can see that it's in English. And like the soldier who's brought it to him, Johann could not read English. And so he's looking around the table. He's got this great poker game going. He's having so much fun. He didn't want to step away and have to get a translator and read this note, which to him was probably meaningless anyways. And so he tells the soldier that, you know what, he'll read it later. And he takes the note and he puts it in his pocket and he goes back to playing poker. Johann would never read that note. And in a couple of hours, Johann would be dead. Johann Rall was a colonel fighting for Great Britain during the American Revolution. And he and his Hessian brigade that had taken up residence in this home inside of Trenton, New Jersey, believed the American rebels were on the verge of defeat. And certainly they were not about to launch an attack now, not on a freezing cold December night. But they were wrong. That farmer was a British loyalist, and what he saw when he looked out the window at the end of his road was the famous American military general George Washington and his ragtag army after they had just completed their famous secret crossing of the Delaware River. That note Johann was handed was a warning that they were on the way. Had he bothered to read it, he and his well-trained Hessians could have very easily crushed Washington and his men, and that would have been the end of the American Revolution, and America would still be a British colony today. Instead, Johann and his men were caught off guard and wiped out, and the Americans would go on to win the war and their independence from Great Britain. In 1912, 37-year-old David Blair was a senior merchant seaman working for the British shipping company called White Star Line. In February of that year, he was informed by his company that he would be the second officer of this massive luxury cruise liner that was still being built in Northern Ireland. As the second officer, David's primary responsibility was the ship's navigational operations, amongst other things. Now, David had handled these responsibilities on other ships, but he'd never done it on a ship of this size. This would easily be the most challenging thing David had done in his career to date. But he told his family he was really excited about it. David immediately moved to Belfast, where the ship was being built, and he lived there for 3 months until construction was done. On April 2nd, the final rivet was put into the ship, and it was launched successfully into the water. And then after that, David and the rest of the crew and staff got on board and they set sail. Their first stop was Southampton in the UK, and for this leg of the journey, it was just going to be the crew and the staff. 2 days later, they arrived without incident, and for the next several days, the ship remained in port as the crew prepped it for its first true maiden voyage, which was going to be to New York City. On April 10th, all preparations had been made, and finally it was time to allow the paying customers to come on board. And in just a couple of hours, thousands of people were on board this huge ship. And just hours before they were set to depart, David was given some bad news. His bosses at White Star Line had decided that this journey was too high profile, and while David certainly had experience, he didn't have a lot of experience with huge ships. And so he was being replaced with someone who did. Understandably, he was crushed. But more than this being a disappointment, this 11th hour change was a huge hassle. With literally thousands of passengers getting in the way all over the ship, David needed to scramble and run all over the place and collect all of his things in the cabin, up on the bridge, in various closets he had put things. He had to do that as fast as he could before the ship took off. And so finally, after doing that with his last armful of luggage in hand, he said goodbye to the crew and to the staff. He said best of luck to his replacement, and he walked off the ship for good. David, with all of his luggage, made his way to a hotel where immediately that night he wrote a letter to his family saying how disappointed he was, and then after that he went to bed. The next morning, when he was going through all of his luggage, he discovered that he had taken a key by accident from the ship. And this key was to a special closet that he was in charge of as the second officer that contained all of the ship's binoculars. And so he felt terrible, but there was nothing he could do. The ship had already left and was on its way to New York. And so the best he could do was he would mail the key back to them in New York when they got there. Back on board the ship, when they discovered this key was missing, they did figure out that David must have it because he was the only one who would have had the key, and it's a brand new ship, so nobody else would have had it. But they decided that it wasn't worth turning around to go get this key. They figured their lookouts were skilled enough they could spot any obstructions with their naked eye. Well, 5 days later, that ship, the Titanic, struck an iceberg and sunk, killing 1,500 people. One of the very few survivors was a guy named Fred Fleet. He was one of the lookouts who actually saw the iceberg first, and he would testify at a Senate inquiry that if he had had binoculars, he would have been able to see the iceberg far enough in advance that they could have avoided it. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin On the evening of June 28, 1997, an 83-year-old woman named Leela Howard turned up the radio in the living room of her small home in Texas, and then she took a seat next to her husband, Raymond, on the couch. This was a song that both of them loved, and in the past, Leela knew her husband would have swooped her up and begun dancing with her right away. But Raymond was now 88 years old, he was also recovering from brain surgery, and they both were planning to go to bed in the next few minutes because they had a big day the next day. They were going to go to the Pioneer Day Music Festival, which is an annual fiddling festival located about 15 miles away from where Leela and Raymond lived, in the town of Salado, Texas. Leela and Raymond attended this festival basically every year, and so even though Raymond right now was a bit fragile from his surgery and his advanced age, the couple had not even considered missing it. Leela's son Hal had tried to persuade Leela to let him, Hal, drive the couple to the music festival, but Leela said no because Leela and Raymond were both fiercely independent and wanted to be in control of their lives, which included driving to and from this festival. Also, Leela had talked about maybe going someplace else after the festival ended with Raymond, kind of spontaneously just driving out and doing something, and so she really wanted to have her own car in case she did want to do that. And so after a few minutes, Leela and Raymond's favorite song came to an end, and the DJ hopped back on the radio and began talking about the weather and the traffic. And at that point, Raymond and Leela, they stood up from the couch, they took each other's hands, and they walked upstairs to go to bed. The next morning, so June 29th, Leela and Raymond walked out the front door of their house, and they walked down to their driveway where their Oldsmobile car was parked. Leela helped Raymond get into the passenger seat, and then Leela took her spot in the driver's seat. And then a few moments later, after they were all buckled in and situated, Leela fired up the car, backed out the driveway, and began driving. That evening, Leela's son, Hal, decided to swing by Leela and Raymond's house to check in on them and see how the festival went. And so at about 5 p.m., Hal got to their house, and right away when he pulled up, he noticed that Leela and Raymond's car, the Oldsmobile, was not in the driveway. And so Hal thought that was pretty odd because by now they should have been back from the festival. In years past, they would always get home by about 3 p.m. at the absolute latest because they didn't like staying out late, and so it just seemed odd that they were not back by now. But at the same time, Hal knew that Leela had been thinking about maybe going out and doing something spontaneous after the event was over, and so he thought, maybe his mom and Raymond were out driving around somewhere and they'd be back later. But just for good measure, Hal did park the car and he walked up to the front door of the house and he did knock, but when there was no answer, he thought, you know what, I'll just go home and come back in a few hours and check in on them at that point. And so, a few hours later, at 8 p.m., Hal drove back to Leela and Raymond's house, and when he got there, he saw their car was still not back yet. And so now Hal's starting to feel pretty worried, and so he parked the car, he walked up to the front door, he did knock, there was no answer, and so he pulled out his set of keys, he opened up the door, and he walked inside. Now, as soon as he was in the house, nothing looked out of place. It actually looked very organized and clean like it normally was. But as he walked around looking for some sign of where Leela and Raymond were, all he could find was on one of the beds there were all these neat stacks of clothes that were laid out as if somebody was getting ready to pack but didn't finish packing. And so it just seemed like something's off here, something's not right. This doesn't seem like they just went out and did something spontaneous. Something must have happened at the festival. That's why they're not back yet. And so kind of in a panic, Hal ran outside and he called the police. And after reporting Leela and Raymond missing, he actually began calling news stations and telling them, can you please put out my mom and Raymond's picture because they're older and they're missing. I need your help. And in fact, that night, those TV stations did begin putting out all these reports about how Leela and Raymond were missing and for people to be on the lookout for them and their car. At the same time, the police immediately launched an investigation, and they quickly discovered that Leela and Raymond had never even made it to the music festival. They never got there. And then when the police drove the route that Leela would have taken to get to the music festival, they didn't find any car accidents or anything unusual on the route that would indicate that they got into some trouble or something. They checked their phone records, and Leela and Raymond had called nobody. There was no action on their credit cards, and so they hadn't bought anything. And the police would send out all these missing person reports to police officers all over the state of Texas, and nobody reported seeing anything or hearing anything. That is, until 3 days later on July 2nd. On that night, a police officer in a little town in Arkansas, located 500 miles away from where Leila and Raymond lived, this police officer was driving down the road when he spotted an Oldsmobile that was driving with its lights off. And so the officer pulled the car over and he ran the license plate, and it came back as belonging to Leila and Raymond. But you gotta remember that this police officer was in Arkansas, and so he had not received any updates about this missing couple. All those TV broadcasts and all the missing person alerts that were getting sent out all over the place, those were really only happening in the state of Texas. And so this officer has no clue that Leila and Raymond are missing. But he runs the plate, he sees it belongs to Leila and Raymond, and he goes up to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees Leila and Raymond. Leila's driving, Raymond's in the passenger seat, and they look like a really happy older couple. And the officer would say to Leila, "Hey, you're driving with your lights off." And Leila would say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. We were driving in Texas, and we got lost, and I just didn't notice. I'm really sorry." The officer believed her and felt like these were good people who just made an honest mistake, and so he just flicked her lights on and said, "I'm going to give you a warning, no big deal, no ticket, but be careful with your lights. You got to make sure those are on at night." And Leila said, "Thank you very much, of course, I'll be very careful with my lights." And then actually the officer gave Leila directions on how to get back to Texas from Arkansas, and then he got back in his cruiser, and then he watched as Leila and Raymond pulled onto the main road and then disappeared into the darkness. The police officer in Arkansas who pulled them over would eventually put it together who he had pulled over, and at that point, Arkansas would get in on the search for Leila and Raymond. But for the next 2 weeks, despite having both states aggressively searching for this couple, nobody could find them. That is until July 12th, so that's 10 days after Leila and Raymond got pulled over by that cop in Arkansas. On that day, these two young boys were walking by a small stream in a town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, when they began to smell a terrible smell. They would end up telling their parents, who would come back to the stream and they'd smell it too, and they would end up alerting the police, and the police would come out and they would search that entire area, and they would find Leila and Raymond's Oldsmobile at the base of a 25-foot cliff, and inside the vehicle were Leila and Raymond, and they were both deceased. It looked very much like Leila and Raymond had driven off this cliff and they had landed down below, and that's what killed them. But when investigators went up to the top of that cliff, there were no skid marks on the cliff itself, which meant Leila, who was driving, never hit the brakes as she went over the cliff. Nobody knows why Leila and Raymond abruptly left their town and drove hundreds of miles into Arkansas instead of going to their favorite music festival, although their family members have speculated that it could be because Leila and Raymond had declining cognitive function, and so they basically didn't know what was going on, and that's why it happened. But the reason this story is in this video is because this story about Leila and Raymond is what inspired a very, very famous song from the late 1990s. It's called "The Way" by Fastball, and for copyright reasons, we can't play it for you, but I'll sing you a line and see if you can remember this song. Where were they going without ever knowing the way? Anyone can see the road that they walk on is paved in gold. It's always summer, you'll never get cold. You'll never be hungry, you'll never be old and gray. Boom, there you go. If you know the song, now you know it's got a pretty intense backstory. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. After getting out of the military at the end of 2017, the transition from military life to civilian life was so overwhelming that it sent me spiraling into a deep depression. Luckily, before I did anything rash, I took my family and friends' advice and sought out a therapist. And my therapist quickly identified that a lot of my depression stemmed from things that I couldn't change. And so my therapist not only showed me this kind of truth to my life, but they also helped me reframe the way I think about those triggers. And eventually, their help allowed me to accept the past and just move on. And so this was a huge turning point for me because it showed me therapy actually works. Now, therapy is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but if you're struggling right now and you don't know what to do, consider giving therapy a try. And a great therapy platform to try, especially for folks who have never used therapy before, is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey online, and then it's up to you how you communicate with your therapist, whether that's through messaging or video or phone call or some combination. You can also switch your therapist at any time at no additional charge. Join over 4 million people who have used BetterHelp and start living a healthier and happier life. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen or just click on MrBallen during the sign-up process for a special discount on your first month of BetterHelp. Okay, back to the stories. Late one afternoon in April of 2019, a middle-aged woman named Mary was cutting up some vegetables in her kitchen in northern Spain when she heard a knock on her front door. So she put her things down, she went to the door, opened it up, and standing there was her next door neighbor, who was all smiles, and she was holding this big box that was wrapped in wrapping paper and had a big bow on it, and then sitting on top of this big gift was a tray of deep-fried rolls, or croquettes. Mary's neighbor was a 61-year-old woman named Carmen Marino, who was an exceptional chef, and her specialty were making these croquettes. They were filled with different types of meat and other things, and all the time, Carmen would come over and give them to Mary, and Mary loved these croquettes. And so as soon as she saw those, she was like, wow, amazing, and she invited Carmen inside. But Carmen didn't come inside. Instead, she took the croquettes and handed them to Mary, and Mary's like, okay, great, thank you. But Carmen was still standing right outside holding this box, and now Mary's looking at her thinking that Carmen looks kind of uneasy. And so Mary said, what's going on here? What's up with this box? Carmen was silent for a second and just kind of held this box out, at which point Mary realized, okay, so she's trying to give me this gift. And so Mary reached out and took this huge present, and she was like, thank you, Carmen. Like, what is this? What's going on? And Mary, when she looked at Carmen, she could tell Carmen's face was now bright red. She was very embarrassed about something, maybe whatever she was going to say. And so Mary just waited for Carmen to speak. And so eventually Carmen she would clear her voice, and then she would say, Mary, this is really embarrassing, but I need you to hold on to this box for a little bit. It contains my sex toys, and I'm having company over at my house, and I'm just worried that somehow they're gonna find these things. Mary was so caught off guard by what Carmen was telling her that she just started laughing. But Carmen didn't join in on the laughter. She just kind of looked down like she was totally mortified. Mary stopped laughing because she felt bad, and then Carmen kind of elaborated on why she had this huge box full of sex toys. She would tell Mary that, she bought them with the intent of using them with her boyfriend, but a couple of months ago he had broken up with her. But Carmen had held on to these in the hopes that the boyfriend would eventually take her back and they would get back together again and get to use these toys. And so even though this was a totally weird and kind of uncomfortable request, Mary kind of felt bad for Carmen. One, because she had to make this request of Mary, but also two, it was obvious that Carmen was pretty shaken up about, losing her boyfriend. And so Mary said, you know what? No problem, Carmen. I will look after your sex toys and I will enjoy your croquettes. And Carmen was so relieved and said, thank you so much. And then she turned and hustled back to her house. And then Mary shut the door and she brought the croquettes into the kitchen and she tried one and it was so good. And then she took the big box of sex toys and she went into the hallway. She opened up a closet and she put it on the top shelf and then shut the door. Over the next couple of days, Mary expected Carmen to come back over and reclaim her box of sex toys, but Carmen didn't. And when days turned into weeks and then turned into months, and still Carmen had not come over to get the sex toys, Mary was kind of annoyed, but she was just too embarrassed to go over to Carmen and be like, hey, why don't you come over and get your sex toys? And so Mary just decided she would leave it alone and not talk about it, and if ever Carmen wanted them back, she could have them, but if she never asked for them again, Mary didn't care. She would just eventually throw the box away, and that would be it. A few months later, on September 29th, 2019, so we're talking about 6 months or so from when the sex toys were first brought over to Mary's house, well, on this day, Mary was kind of doing chores in her house when she began to smell a really bad smell coming from the hallway closet where the box of sex toys were. And so Mary opened up the closet, and for sure, she could tell the bad smell was coming from this closet. And so she started by smelling the shoes that were towards the bottom of the closet to see if maybe she had stepped in something gross, but they were all clean. And then eventually she reached the sex toy box. She pulled it down from the top shelf, and it had never been opened. It's still wrapped, but she just smelled the box and she immediately recoiled because that had to be where the terrible smell was coming from. It was coming from this box. And so Mary was totally repulsed at the idea that these sex toys smell horrible, but she carried the box into the kitchen and set it down, and she thought, is this a horrible betrayal of my friend's trust if I open up this box and look at her sex toys? But Mary ultimately was like, you know what? Carmen has not come back for this thing. I'm opening this up because I need to know what's making this smell. And so Mary went over and got a pair of scissors and she cut off the wrapping paper, and then she opened up the box, and inside was like this big thing that had been wrapped in tinfoil. So all you saw was tinfoil. And so Mary, she reached down and kind of began to peel back the tinfoil. It was kind of sticking to whatever was under it. But eventually, after she kind of yanked on it, she pulled the tinfoil off. And when she saw what was in there, she began screaming and ran outside and called the police. It would turn out Mary's neighbor, Carmen, who owned the box of sex toys, well, her boyfriend didn't just break up with her a couple of months before she brought the sex toys over. No, her boyfriend, who was a 67-year-old man named Jesus Baranda, he went missing around the time that supposedly Carmen and her boyfriend broke up. And so naturally, Jesus's family began looking for Jesus, and when they couldn't find him, they called the police. And eventually the police called Carmen and said, hey, you were dating Jesus around the time he went missing. We're going to need to come to your house and search it. And when Carmen heard that, she knew she had a big problem, because Carmen had murdered Jesus and cut his head off with a chainsaw, and she still had his head in her house. And so what did she do? Well, she boiled his head down, and then she put it in a box, wrapped it in tinfoil, and then she wrapped that box in wrapping paper, put a bow on it, and then went next door to Mary's house and said, hey, can you hold my sex toys for me? Because she knew Mary would likely not look in the box if it was sex toys. And so Mary took the box, put it in her closet, and then of course, the smell began several months later, and she would discover Jesus's head. Carmen was convicted of murdering her boyfriend, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Police were never able to locate the rest of Jesus. All they had was his head. But there's a running theory that Carmen may have used the rest of her boyfriend's body and ground it up and then baked him into her croquettes that she gave out to people like Mary and other people in her neighborhood. But that's just a theory. On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels, and, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping. It was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to, and he feels himself. He's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open, and he climbed out of his car, and he looked a little ways down the road, and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side, and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck, and so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was. And then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open, and this woman with blonde hair jumped out, and she ran over to him, and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman, and he's kind of sizing her up, and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van, and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair, and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman, and the old woman's looking right back, and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what, I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded, and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor-trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out, and she rushed over to the truck, and she climbed on top of it, and she reached down, and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van, and the white van sped off down the road, and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor-trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically, meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately loads of sightings were reported of Juan, but every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear, and the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the US Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid and just didn't say anything and kind of just stepped back like this, like he wasn't going to answer. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved. If you didn't hear the huge announcement we made last week, well, here it is again. The MrBallen podcast, our top podcast, the one we launched in 2022 that immediately rocketed to the top of the charts, and then by the end of that same year, it got picked up by Amazon. Yeah, that show is now once again available on every podcast platform, and it's free. All you gotta do is go to your choice podcast platform and look for the MrBallen podcast, and boom, you now have access to the hundreds of episodes in our catalog. And if you haven't listened to the podcast since it went exclusive at the end of 2022, then you have a crazy amount of content to go binge. So go find the MrBallen podcast on whatever platform you like, follow the show, leave a positive review, or at least an honest review of the show, because that really helps grow the podcast, and then enjoy. That's it. But a quick caveat, if you've been listening to the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music, well, there's still going to be perks for you. With your Prime membership, you can listen to brand new MrBallen podcast episodes 30 days early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the show right now is available everywhere and it is free. Enjoy the show. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, which has literally hundreds more stories, many of which sound a lot like these, and many of the stories on the podcast are exclusive to the podcast, so you can only get them there. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and you can listen to it on Amazon Music or anywhere else you get your podcasts. It's available everywhere, and it's free. Until next time, thank you so much. See ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Of August 2nd, 1998, a 48-year-old, 6-foot, 6-inch tall hiker named Mike Turner stopped for a moment and took his bottle out of his backpack and took a sip. Mike was standing in a cluster of trees on the side of this mountain about 11,000 feet up, inside of an area in Wyoming called the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. The Fitzpatrick Wilderness is easily one of the most visually striking places in the entire world. It's like all of the extremes of nature kind of collided together in this one place. You have these massive, 13,000 foot tall snow-covered mountain peaks, you have glaciers, and then right below them, right at the base of these huge mountains, are all these lush green fields full of tall grass and flowers and animals running around and little streams and lakes. I mean, it's absolutely picturesque. In fact, some of the pictures of this area, they look fake. They're so ridiculous. But the real reason the Fitzpatrick Wilderness was known as this unbelievably beautiful place was because really it went kind of untouched by people because it was so hard to get to. I mean, basically the only people who stepped foot in this very surreal landscape were really experienced outdoors people like Mike Turner, because it took a lot of know-how just to get to this area and to survive in this area. This is a very, very rugged place. But Mike Turner was not content just going to the Fitzpatrick Wilderness. He really wanted to experience the true nature of this area. And so what he was doing while he was out there was hiking off trail. And so he's in this totally remote place, hiking around in an area that was not even marked on a map. Now, to anybody who has not done any compass and map navigating out in the wild, this might seem totally reckless. And to a degree, it sort of is. But it's something that people totally have a knack for. I can speak from my own experience. When I was in the military, we did a lot of compass and map navigating, like in the backcountry in Alaska and also in California. And I was terrible at it. But I can tell you, some of my classmates definitely had sort of like an innate skill to understand where they were in relationship to terrain features. And then if you combine that with proper training and experience, I mean, these guys got really good at just being able to navigate with a map and compass. And so Mike was one of those people that really was an excellent navigator. And so walking off trail like this in such a remote place was sort of routine for him. Now, Mike was not some full-time adventurer. This was something he did that was sort of a passion for him. His job was he was a reverend at a Christian church in Idaho, and he had been for 10 years. And Mike loved being a reverend. He loved his congregation, and his wife Diane and his 3 kids, he had 2 daughters and a son, they were all super involved in the church. I mean, it was a great thing. But at the same time, being a reverend was a lot of work, a lot of responsibility, and a lot of stress. And a way that Mike had found to kind of cope with that growing stress of being a reverend was to go out hiking. He actually found, sort of ironically, that when he was out in nature hiking, he felt closer to God than when he was inside of his church preaching. And it was because he sort of looked at the world as this grand gift from God. And imagine being in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, looking at this unbelievable terrain. I mean, it looks like, God made this. I mean, who else could? This is so strikingly beautiful. And so with that as context, on this particular day that Mike had stopped to sip water 11,000 feet up on this mountainside, this was actually the 4th day of a 9-day pre-planned solo hike through this wilderness that Mike had been planning out for over a year. Now, even though Mike was a very skilled hiker and backpacker and survivalist, he knew doing any sort of really long solo hike came with a whole bunch of risks that only really come if you're solo hiking. The biggest risk being that if you get into trouble when you're out on a solo hike, well, you're all alone, so you better have a really good plan for what you're going to do if you get into trouble. And so Mike had come up with a great plan. He had spent that whole year mapping out this off-trail path he was going to take over these 9 days. It was a 60-mile trip through the Fitzpatrick Wilderness, and he drew out basically exactly where he expected to go on a map, and he gave that map with all the different coordinates and exactly where he'd be on each day to his wife, who also was a very enthusiastic hiker, and he told her, on the 9th day, you're going to meet me at this spot at the end of the 60 miles at noon on this 9th day right here, and I will meet you there and you can take me home. However, that plan had changed on that 4th day as Mike was sipping his water on the mountainside. And only Mike knew it because he had no way to communicate back to his friends and family. Cell phones were very primitive at the time, so he couldn't just call somebody. I mean, basically, if he deviated his plan, he was the only one who would know. Now, the reason why Mike, on the 4th day of this 9-day trip, decided to alter his course made a lot of sense. So even though Mike was technically solo hiking, he was not actually alone. With him was the family dog named Andy, who was a very good-natured black lab mix who loved going hiking. And over the course of the previous day and then into this 4th day, he and Andy had been up at elevation at about 13,000 feet, walking on some icy parts of the mountain, and Andy's paws were getting really raw from kind of walking on the jagged ice. And that day, on the 4th day, Mike had noticed Andy was whimpering and struggling to keep up when normally Andy was super energetic and running all around. And he knew that, my course that I'm supposed to be going on for the next few days is going to be going all through these mountains with all this ice. And I don't think Andy can keep up. He's not going to be able to do it. And so he had decided to side skirt the mountains to avoid the ice. And even though this path was definitely going to take him a little bit longer, it would still bring him to the same destination, to that same pickup spot where his wife and his family would be waiting for him. Now, Mike understood that by deviating his route, not only would his family not know, like they would have no idea where he was, but also this secondary route he'd be taking to save Andy's paws was going to take a little bit longer than the intended course would take. And so he knew he was not going to be there at the time he said he would. So he was not going to be there at noon on the 9th day. It was going to be maybe the 10th day or beyond. But Mike had planned for this contingency. He had brought extra supplies specifically if he had to extend his journey. And so he felt confident that even though this was a big risk, to take this path that nobody knows he's on, he felt he could do it with no problems. And so after Mike finished taking a sip of his water, he pulled a bowl from his pack that was for Andy, and he poured some water in it, and he placed it on the ground, and Andy kind of made his way over and began lapping at the water. And as he did, Mike looked down and saw Andy's tail wagging happily. And Mike felt confident, seeing how much better his dog was already doing, that this was definitely the right decision. Taking this secondary route was definitely the way to go. But as Mike waited for his dog to finish drinking, Andy suddenly stopped and then lifted his head up with his ears perked up like he had sensed something. And then before Mike could stop him, Andy just took off running into the trees and disappeared. Now, Andy was a playful dog that periodically kind of ran around on the hikes like this. But remember, Mike is out in the backcountry and he's deviated his path. He needs to be really sure of where he is. He can't afford to make mistakes here. And if Andy just goes rogue and he has to go chase after him, the opportunity to get turned around or lost, or maybe come in contact with some big predator that maybe Andy has sensed, were pretty high. And so Mike grabbed the bowl and took off running into the trees after Andy. And after going into those trees, he emerged on the other side, Mike did, and suddenly he was hit with this incredible view, kind of looking down towards this lake. And there was this huge clearing on this side of the mountain that was filled with these huge boulders, like boulders the size of small cars, and they were everywhere. Basically, the mountain, as it eroded, chunks of rock were rolling down into this clearing that was sort of at a slant down towards this lake, and it just filled the entire clearing with boulders, to the point where you really couldn't actually walk on solid ground. The only way to get from where Mike was and where Andy was, because at this point he could see his dog was making his way towards the lake. Clearly, that's what Andy had sensed, the lake, and he was going to get a drink or something. And so Mike knew to get to his dog, he would basically have to climb onto the boulders and jump from rock to rock all the way to his dog. And so Mike tried calling for Andy one more time to stop and come back, but Andy was on his own program going towards the lake. And so, resigned to the situation, Mike climbed on top of the first boulder and began jumping boulder to boulder in the direction of his dog. 1 week later, on the afternoon of August 9th, Mike's wife, Diane, along with her 3 kids and some family friends, stood at the start of a trail called the Big Sandy Trail, which was the designated meeting spot where Mike said he would meet his family at the end of this 9-day journey. And as Diane stood there at this meeting place, she kept anxiously checking her watch. Mike was late, and not just a few minutes late. He was a full 24 hours late. Mike was supposed to be there on the 8th at noon, and now it's the 9th, and he's still not here. But remember, Mike is a guy that did stuff like this fairly regularly. He was very competent out in the wild, and everybody knew when he went off on this journey that, of course, there was some variability to when he would actually arrive at the meeting place. You know, despite Mike saying, "I'll be there on the 8th at noon," Diane and her friends and family all sort of felt like, well, I hope he's there at noon, but realistically, he might be, several hours or maybe even a day late, and that's okay. And so the day before, when he didn't show up at noon, people were anxious, but they were okay. Now, 24 hours later, and still Mike has not shown up, there's no trace of him, Diane and her kids and the family friends, they were starting to worry. And in fact, before Mike left on this trip, he told Diane that if for some reason he does not show up on the 9th, so 24 hours after he said he would be there, and it's past 4 o'clock on the 9th, this is the trigger point, that Diane should call the authorities and assume something is wrong and send out a search party. And so Diane is checking her watch on the 9th, and soon enough, it's 4 p.m., Mike's not here, 4:05, 4:10, 4:15, still no Mike. And even though she knew her husband said, "Now it's time, go get the authorities," she just couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt like it's such a huge to-do if you get a search party organized out here. I mean, that's a massive effort, super expensive. And she felt like the second she told authorities that Mike would come walking out of the wilderness with a big story to tell and a big apology for being late. And so she convinced herself that, you know what, give him one more day, I'm sure he's bound to show up. But the next day, on the 10th, when still there was no sign of Mike, that morning, Diane did go to the authorities and she reported Mike missing. And just as she expected, a massive search was launched for Mike. But you need to keep in mind here that again, Diane and the searchers and everybody besides Mike has no idea that he has altered the path he was on. And they're going to be searching this massive expanse of wilderness that even with the best of conditions, knowing exactly where someone is on their route, I mean, it's so hard to find people out here. I mean, it's totally rugged. Things are obscured from view, from the air, from the land. There are areas you can't even get to. There's predators out there. I mean, this is a dangerous thing to be doing. And again, they don't know he's not even on that path anymore. He's deviated. And so, despite helicopters in the air, horseback teams out in force, hundreds of volunteers combing the area looking for Mike, nobody found a trace of him. And after 2 weeks went by with this huge search producing nothing, they finally had to call it off. And so, of course, Mike's family is just unbelievably devastated. They have no idea what's happened to Mike. Have you ever thought to yourself, man, I just wish I could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in live storytelling format? Well, guess what? That is now a reality. Because I am going on tour. I'm going to go to 15 different cities around the country and stand on a stage and tell some wild stories to anybody who wants to join. And these will be a combination of old school classic, MrBallen strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and some new ones that have not been published on any of our platforms. So some new stuff you can only get if you come see me live. But you gotta act fast because we just announced this tour last week and already tickets are being bought at a record speed here. So if you want tickets, you gotta act now. all you have to do is go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, there are general seating tickets, and there's also the VIP package if you want to meet this guy, okay? So that's over here. And for our VIP ticket holders, bring your graphic novel with you if you bought it on pre-sale, or you can actually buy a copy of the book at the venue, and I will sign the book during our meet and greet. So that's just for the VIP people. Bring your graphic novel, or you'll have a chance to buy the graphic novel at the venue, and I will sign it for you when we finally get to meet. So again, go to tour.ballenstudios.com and get your tickets now. I will see you there. Five days later, so 5 days after the end of the official search, we're now at August 28th at this point. A couple of backpackers were hiking through an area in the Fitzpatrick Wilderness that was actually about 17 miles away from the last known sighting of Mike Turner. Now, that was not when he went through the trees and saw the boulders. This was around the time Mike literally began the 9-day epic journey. Somebody had seen him in one area, and so where these two backpackers are is about 17 miles away from there. And so these two backpackers, they were aware that Mike Turner was missing because there were flyers up all over the place around the outside of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness at the beginning of all the trailheads and in town and all over the place. So they were aware of this, aware that Mike was missing and his dog was missing. And as they're just sitting there taking a break, this totally emaciated, ragged-looking black lab came out of the tree line, whimpering and looking like it was on its last legs. It was Andy. And right away, these backpackers knew that's the missing dog. And so they lured the dog to them with granola bars, and Andy came up and he ate, they gave him water. And just so you know, Andy would survive and make a full recovery. And so after these backpackers have Andy in their possession, they immediately contacted authorities, who then got in touch with Mike's family and said, hey, we found Andy. And so you can imagine the absolute roller coaster of emotion Mike Turner's family is going through. Now that they hear Andy is okay, Andy's come out of the forest, they're thinking, oh my goodness, maybe Mike is okay too. Maybe Andy can lead us back to where Mike is. Mike is this totally skilled survivalist. He's got to be alive out there. And so after discovering Andy, a second search was launched using Andy as the guide dog. They basically went to that spot where the backpackers found him, and basically Andy's family and some other volunteers allowed Andy to lead them back into the wilderness, hoping it would lead them to Mike. And so as this new search began with Andy leading the way, a separate backpacker, who we will call Brian, just for the sake of the story, that's not his name, but we're going to call him Brian, he was hiking through a section of the Fitzpatrick Wilderness not near where Andy was. This is a separate area. And Brian, he was not involved in looking for Mike Turner, but he was aware that Mike was missing because, again, he had seen all the missing person flyers, he'd seen the news, and when he began his own hike into the wilderness, he had seen at the start of his own trailhead a big flyer with a picture of Mike Turner and his dog saying he was missing. So Brian's aware of Mike Turner's absence, but he's just going on his own hike into the wilderness. And after a few days of solo hiking his way into this totally rugged expanse, he eventually reaches this kind of dense cluster of trees about 11,000 feet up on the side of a mountain, and he walks through those trees, and when he emerges on the other side, out in front of him, sloping down to a lake, is this unbelievable boulder field that practically takes his breath away. But that was not the thing that really got his attention. Instead, as he's taking in these boulders and this unbelievable view of the mountains in the distance and this lake, he noticed there was a man sitting on a rock fairly far across this boulder field with his back to Brian, just staring at the lake. Now, remember, this is like the middle of nowhere, and Brian certainly was not expecting to come across any other person on this journey. And so naturally he thought, okay, I need to go up and make sure this guy is okay, or if nothing else, I want to talk to him. I mean, this is a very rare thing to come in contact with other people out here. And so Brian began walking towards this guy to see what was going on. Well, that man was the missing hiker, Mike Turner, and my goodness, did Mike Turner have a story to tell. But to understand Mike's story, we need to go back 29 days to the point when Andy the dog had taken off running from Mike and he had gone into the boulder field, and Mike had emerged through those trees and seen the boulders, he's seen his dog, and he began climbing onto that first rock to begin making his way towards his dog. So Mike, he gets up on that rock and he begins hopping from boulder to boulder to boulder. And at first it's going fine. He gets about halfway across the boulder field. He's, yelling to Andy to stay put, and he's kind of making his way. It's all good. But then he reaches this one particularly large boulder that when he jumped onto it, it was kind of unstable and it began to wobble under his feet. And so instinctively, Mike tried to leap off of the wobbly boulder onto another boulder that was right nearby. But when he jumped, he sort of undershot this second boulder and so did not land on it and stay put on it. Instead, he kind of hit the face of this second boulder and slipped down to the ground. Didn't hurt Mike. He's just now on the ground in this small space between the boulders. However, unfortunately, the wobbly boulder right behind Mike, well, it didn't just continue to wobble. It wobbled to the point where it rolled forward and literally came to a rest against the second boulder that Mike had just jumped onto and failed to land on top of. Basically, wobbly boulder impacted second boulder, sandwiching Mike between them. But critically, it did not harm Mike. This is going to take some explaining, but it'll make sense after I go through it. Wobbly boulder had what looked like almost a U-shaped cutout on the face of the wobbly boulder. Like imagine a perfectly round boulder, but there's like a divot kind of sitting on the front of it. And it just so happened that on the second boulder in front of wobbly boulder, it also had a sort of divot on the face of it, kind of looking like a U-shape. And when these two boulders collided, these 800-pound boulders, Mike happened to be standing exactly in the position where those two cutouts wrapped around him like shackles. They basically pinned his ankles together, where he could not pull his legs up and out of this totally tight space that was just big enough to hold his legs in place. It was like he was anchored to the ground. But again, Mike is unharmed. His legs aren't broken. He's not battered, nothing. He just cannot move. Now, Mike instantly would have known this is a really big issue because he can't move these 800-pound boulders. They are 800 pounds. And he's by himself, minus his dog, who can't really help him with the boulders. And so Mike immediately just jumps into, oh my goodness, I have to find a way to somehow just move these boulders, even just a millimeter, a centimeter would be enough to free his feet. And so he pulled off his bag and one by one, he pulled out every piece of equipment he had, including his camera tripod and his stove and whatever he had. And he did everything he could to try to pry these stupid boulders off of him, but they would not budge. And so after 2 hours of trying in vain to free himself, it dawned on Michael that he was not going to be able to free himself. The only way he was getting out of here is if somebody found him and rescued him. And so Mike, doing his best to stay calm, he pulled out his journal he had brought along for this trip in order to detail, his closeness with God and, what he was learning throughout this journey. And he began documenting what happened to him to include, why he was in this boulder field, what he was doing when he got stuck, how he wound up in these sort of granite shackles, so to speak. He also very clearly in his writing was very much putting his faith in God to get him out of here. He wrote in his journal on this first day, 2 hours into this predicament, I am in your hands, Lord. I don't know what I may face. The idea being, I don't know what's going to happen to me, but my faith is in you. I know you will help me through this. And so after writing this initial entry, Mike turned his attention to survival, like not trying to push the boulders off, but trying to survive amidst the boulders as long as possible. And so he pulled out his blue sleeping bag and kind of wrapped it around himself to insulate himself. He got out his stove and there was some snow in reach, and he began putting snow in his stove and melting it to create water. And he also pulled his tent flap over the top of him. He was basically setting up camp inside of these boulders. And that first night must have been absolutely horrifying. The temperatures dropped down to near freezing, even though during the day it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But that night he's in this horrible position, just trapped with his own thoughts, just hoping and praying that, God was going to get him out of here. The next day when Mike woke up, he wrote in his journal some more, and he began detailing his biggest fears. One of them was potentially having to have his legs amputated if he got out of here. The damage of losing circulation to his legs was scary. He wrote that he had food for at least a week, but he only had 2 quarts of water, and there wasn't all that much snow around him left to melt, and he was running out of fuel, and so he was really worried about not having enough water, even though, very ironically, he was like 25-30 feet away from a lake, which he could have drank water from, but again, he's trapped to the ground. And so on the second day, Mike actually attempted to throw his water bottle, which he connected some rope to try to get it into the lake, to capture some water and pull it back to him. But when he threw it, it was just short of the water. He could not get it into the water, so he couldn't scoop any water into his bottle. And then when he tried to retrieve the bottle, as the bottle was being dragged towards him, it got wedged in some rocks. And again, he can't move, so he can't possibly fling it out of these rocks. And so he couldn't even get his water bottle back. And so by the end of that second day, Mike's tone in his journal began to change. It wasn't totally negative yet, but he began talking about how, man, I wonder what's going to happen when I run out of water. I wonder what my urine will taste like if I mix it with Crystal Light. So it was kind of like he was joking about the fact that he was going to try to make his pee taste better, but it also showed he was beginning to realize just how serious the situation was. Nobody knows where he is. He's completely off the beaten path. He has no idea if anybody even knows he's in trouble, and he's about to be out of water. The next day, so the third day of being trapped inside of these boulders, Mike would once again begin writing in his journal. And his tone seemed a bit more optimistic, despite the fact that he has not solved, this water crisis he's about to face. He's down to his literal last quart of water. But in his journal, he talked about how this whole trip he went on, this 9-day trip he had planned out, the whole point was to become closer to God. And he felt like, you know what? I've really done that in the past couple of days. What I wanted to achieve, having a really spiritual event here, it's happened like times 100 being trapped here. I mean, this is the closest I've ever felt to God. But you could just tell there was just an underlying sense that I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to learn from this experience. I'm not going to take stupid risks anymore. I'm going to be a better father, be a better husband, be a better reverend. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to improve as a result of this suffering I'm going through right now. However, over the next few days that Mike continued to be trapped in these rocks with no help coming, his optimism clearly waned. He began to write that he was angry with God. He wondered, is this a punishment for something I've done? And he also thought, maybe I failed God, and that's why I'm here. But it was just clear that Mike, who was this deeply spiritual person who absolutely believed in a higher power, how could he be in this terrible position and not be getting any sort of help from God? How could that be? But unfortunately for Mike, his situation only got worse. On about day 5 or 6, as Mike was laying wretchedly inside of this horrible camp he had built, he noticed that he had completely lost feeling in his left leg. Like completely. It was a dead leg at this point. And even though he knew by this point how bad of a situation he was in, this sparked a new, very real fear inside of Mike that he detailed in his journal. He knew his body was actually beginning to break down, and still there is no help, no divine help coming in despite all his prayers. There's no one coming to rescue him. He is all alone. In fact, Mike would write in his journal something that practically brought me to tears when I read it first, and it just said, "So lonely, more than I imagined." I just can't picture what it would be like to be trapped out there. You're not hurt, but you can't go anywhere, and you're all alone, just slowly withering away. And your family, they're somewhere out there, they have no idea, nobody knows. It's just unbelievably devastating. The mental torture this man went through is just out of this world. But it just keeps getting worse. Day 6, day 7, Mike at some point actually dropped his journal, and because he can't actually reach it anymore, he just picked up whatever objects he had and continued writing on them, like his pocket Bible, and then also there was an instruction manual for his stove, and he would write in the margins, and his writing just continued to get more and more pessimistic and sad. He began writing about how intensely he regretted his decision to take the long route. He was totally setting him up for this situation. Nobody would have known where he is. And so he's hating on himself. He's still mad at God. Why aren't you here? Aren't you seeing how badly I'm suffering? I mean, this is a guy who's basically losing his mind with regret and anguish and just pure loneliness. I mean, this is horrible. But then on the 7th and 8th day or 9th day that he was stuck in these boulders, once again, Mike's writing on his random things that he wrote on took another turn. Not only was his writing becoming more and more illegible, because he's literally dying here. I mean, his body's breaking down. He's exposed to the sun all day, and then at night it's freezing cold. He's not having any water. He's drinking his urine. He's got no food left. He can barely write. His writing begins to talk about his family and his children. At this point, Mike must have known the end is near. And so all he had was just the thoughts of his family. He began wondering, what his kid's life were going to be like in the future, because obviously the implication here is he knows he won't be there to see it. He'll be dead. And then in some of the last entries he would make, it was obvious that really Mike had turned back to God. Now he was back to approaching God with open arms. He was no longer upset or questioning God's plan. He was just ready. He actually wrote in his journal, "Fill me with peace, Lord. May my conditions not deny my love for you." And then he wrote, "I'm ready to die, though I'm missing my family." And then in his final entry, which must have been on the 10th day of his predicament, Mike's writing was basically completely illegible at this point because he's right on death's door. And even though you can't really tell what he wrote, at the end of this final entry, it says, "Love, Dad." It was like he was saying his final goodbye to his family. Then Mike took off his wedding band and he placed it on the rock next to him because he knew once he died and decomposed, the ring would fall off his bones and be lost in the rocks below. And he clearly wanted his family to have that wedding ring, so he placed it on the rock and then he prepared to die. When Brian the hiker walked up to the sitting man he saw on this boulder, he realized almost immediately that that was Mike Turner because he had seen the missing person flyers before he came into the wilderness. And so knowing this is the guy they're looking for and knowing he couldn't move him, he covered him up and then he took Mike Turner's wallet, which contained his ID, and then as fast as he could, Brian the hiker made his way back to the beginning of the trailhead and contacted authorities. I will say it took Brian almost 3 days to contact authorities, and he was going as fast as he could, retracing his steps. So that really gives you a sense of really just how remote of an area Mike was in when he passed away. And then also, it would turn out that Andy the dog, who was leading that secondary search, he wouldn't find Mike before Brian would. But once they discovered where Mike had died and they checked the direction Andy was taking his family, it was obvious that Andy was heading in that direction. He was a faithful dog going back to save his owner. He just wasn't going to get there in time. And to close the story out, making it even more tragic, on the day that Mike left his wife Diane and his 3 beautiful children to begin this 9-day trek, after he left, Diane received a bouquet of flowers in the mail that Mike had sent that he knew would arrive after he had left. And attached to this bouquet was a note. And the note was written to Diane, and it just said, "Thank you for letting me live this adventure. Know that wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, I'm thinking of you." Hello, all you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. As many of you may already know, we always have merchandise for sale at shopmrballen.com. But in addition to the year-round offerings that we sell on shopmrballen.com, periodically we'll do a big limited-time merch drop. And we have a new one right now. Dropping today is the new Lungy Most Wanted line. This amazing Lungy themed drop will have a t-shirt, also a tank top available, the Most Wanted Lungy design, as well as some cool stickers. But you gotta act fast because these things sell out quick. All our limited edition drops historically sell out pretty much right away, like first week, if not less. So again, just go to shopmrballen.com and get yourself some sweet, sweet Lungy Most Wanted merch. And if you're wondering, what the heck is he talking about? What is this lore around Lungy and the Most Wanted thing they're talking about? What is that? Well, you need to tune in to my next live stream on YouTube to hear that. Or if you're listening to this post my live stream, just go ahead and click on the live tab on YouTube and you can find the video that explains the lore behind this drop. Again, head to shopmrballen.com and get your mitts on this limited edition exclusive Lungy merch. Enjoy.